colleagues from CASA, University of Victoria, Dean, as well as our attendees. Good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me here to give this lecture. It's certainly a privilege to do this in honor of one of your own. And also it's quite, I think, symbolic since in a way it is a start. No? It is in many ways a start of an advocacy. It is a start of something new. And I feel like back 25 years ago when I started on this, I always say this these days, I felt quite alone because it seemed like I was the guy on the fringe talking about something that people didn't know about and about which it was very hard to communicate about. No? So to talk about the ocean, the marine environment, why it's important, why it should matter, these things for the Filipino people 25 years ago were very far from their principal concerns. But now it's a totally different situation where there is very, very high awareness of our issues with the oceans, of the need to take care of it, about the marine environment, about climate change and its impact on the oceans, and concerns about governance of the oceans. And now, most especially, one of the key geopolitical flashpoints, essentially, on this part of the world, the issues on the South China Sea and our part of it, which we call the West Philippine Sea. So that's why the title is The Philippines in UNCLOS, a struggle for the West Philippine Sea. In many ways, this struggle is, well, it's also an advocacy in a sense. Although our rights to the West Philippine Sea, we insist, are based on international law and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. It is an entitlement that was agreed upon in the course of many years of negotiations. And yet, we still find ourselves struggling to secure due respect to these rights of ours to the West Philippine Sea. And I guess that's really part of, well, it's part of our nature as a maritime and archipelagic nation. Okay? So, to give you an idea, for those of you who are not familiar with our part of the world, the Philippines is that island nation there, that archipelago in the middle. It is comprised of 7,641 islands. And it's, as you see, it's broken up, it's scattered, with a lot of inter-island waters in between. The total land area is only around 300,000 square kilometers. And our population is 118 million as of 2024, according to estimates. It's still growing at about 56%. And the median age is 25.7 years. So it's a rather young population. And because of that, it is seen as having still potential for economic growth. No? And in terms of markets, it's a potential consumer market as well. And that's why there's a lot of pressure on the Philippine government particularly to ensure economic development. Now, of course, economic development will require access to resources. And resources, as you see in this situation, with our fragmented land areas, well, definitely some of those resources will have to come from our sea areas. So our GDP is $1.2 trillion US dollars, according to estimates, and growing still at 5.7%, which is relatively higher compared to our neighbors, especially in the post-pandemic era. But in terms of sectors, you'll notice that agriculture is rather low at 9.1%. Industry is at 27.7% of the total economic activity, and the larger share is in services. And part of this you might have heard about. For example, Filipino seafarers. It is said that 1 out of 4 seafarers in the world are Filipinos. And we continue to export labor, essentially not just in sea-based work, but also in land-based work. And this is how, in a way, the people are making up for the shortcomings in productivity in agriculture and industry. It is through services. Nonetheless, despite that, poverty is still a very major problem. The incidence is about 15.5% according to estimates. Now, as a maritime and archipelagic nation with fragmented land areas, as I mentioned, we find ourselves depending upon the sea for our future. And this is a major challenge, not only in the sense that you need technology to be able to access the ocean. Ships are technology, but all the other means of exploiting exploring, exploiting resources from there, taking the benefits from the ocean, all require some form of technology. But the oceans is not, even though we say that we are entitled to parts of it under international law, we also have to realize that the ocean does not respect political boundaries. It's actually part of a much larger global ocean. And so you see here in this Spillhouse projection, what you see here is that all the oceans of the world are actually connected, interconnected. So whatever happens in one part of the ocean somehow will also affect other parts of it. And it's no different when it comes to geopolitics, in a way, and law, and the rule of law. In the same way that in terms of the marine environment, everything is interconnected, the same goes for our the way that we as a people try to manage and benefit from our oceans. Now, the Philippines, as a maritime and archipelagic nation, has always advocated for the rule of law, and this has manifested in our interest in pushing for principles in the law of the sea. Of course, the law of the sea, or the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea in particular, which is a global multilateral convention that almost comprehensively codifies the rules for the governance of the oceans. Of course, it's as a global agreement, we did have to bear with some compromises. But that's part of the process of being part of an international community. You always have to, in a way, negotiate, and find common ground with other nations. So in a way, that's also what we're continuing to do, trying to find common ground with other nations, such as here in South Africa. Because of our advocacy for the law of the sea, which wasn't easy either from a domestic standpoint, but that's another lecture entirely. But most recently, we've been able to finally undertake the process of harmonizing our domestic law with the international legal framework. And so we have enacted just last year, after decades, actually since 1994, we finally enacted Republic Act 12064 as of November last year, which implements and transforms the relevant provisions of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea into domestic Philippine legislation. Essentially, it legislates the maritime zones of the Philippines in accordance with the UNCLOS system. It declares the way in which we will exercise our sovereignty and jurisdictions within each maritime zone. And it also clarifies, in accordance with UNCLOS, what are the rights and duties of foreign ships and aircraft in these maritime zones, wherever they may be found. This is part of the system, really, for us to be able to secure cooperation from these foreign vessels and aircraft, essentially. And these rights and duties and obligations that we legislated are emphasized to be recognized and granted on the basis of reciprocity and mutual respect. And the reason why that had to be expressly included in the law, I myself was the one who convinced our legislators to put it back in. There were several attempts to delete it, but finally at the end we were able to put it back in. The reason for emphasizing that is the fact that we now find ourselves still continuing that struggle to secure recognition of our rights and entitlements to our own waters. Now, we'll get into that in a few more slides, but because of this, we now have a clear idea of more or less what are the sea areas to which they're entitled to, whether under full sovereignty or through sovereign rights. And you see there in the enumeration of the various zones and the equivalent area, what you see immediately is that compared to the land, which is rounded off to about 300,000 square kilometers, the potential sea area can reach up to 2.2 million square kilometers. And this underscores the reality that as a maritime archipelagic nation, our future really depends on our ability to continue to access and benefit from our sea areas. Now these maritime zones and our rights to each one of these maritime zones are enshrined in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is the accepted global international legal framework for the management of oceans both within and beyond national jurisdiction. This convention is the result of over 30 years of negotiations, extending as far back as 1952, if you just look at the UN and its history of implementing its mandate of progressive development of international law. But actually, in a way, the attempts to codify these rules go back even further, no? Out to the 1920s, no? But they were all unsuccessful prior to that. And if you go back even further than that to ancient times, you'll find that some of the rules contained in the convention are actually practices that date back to the time of the ancient Greeks, no? And their practices, maritime practices in the Mediterranean. So the rules and the laws that are involved here in the UNCLOS actually many of them have a very, very long lineage. All of them attempting to specify exactly what states can or cannot do in the oceans. Now, of course, as a result of the negotiations, new rules were introduced, and one of those rules and concepts I'll emphasize a bit later, because Africa did have a key role in the creation of those new rules. In any case, before we get into that, the UNCLOS is continuing to evolve. After the 1982 UNCLOS entered into force in November 16, 1994, two other conventions also entered into force, implementing various parts of it. Okay? So the 1994 Part 11 Implementation Agreement was hastily negotiated in order to secure the last few ratifications, because there were still a few industrialized countries that were holding out their ratification because they had issues with some of the provisions of UNCLOS, especially those that developing countries, including African nations, pushed hard for during those negotiations. And then you have the 1995 UN Fish Stocks Agreement, which is short for another very, very long title, the United Nations Convention on Highly Migratory Fish Stocks and Straddling Fish Stocks. That one basically implements two provisions of UNCLOS, two specific provisions of UNCLOS on the conservation and management of fisheries in the high seas, which are beyond national jurisdiction. And then 2 years ago, after 2 decades of discussions, another convention was opened for signature, the Convention on Biological Diversity Beyond National Jurisdiction. This one tries now to address not fisheries, but things like genetic resources especially, and biodiversity resources in the deep ocean. This recently got the minimum number of ratifications. So this was just 2 weeks ago. And so it will enter into force next year, January 7, 2026. So you see that in terms of the governance of the oceans, it continues to be the subject of continuing attempts on the part of the international community to negotiate rules. Some of them due to deliberate agreements that they need to have these kinds of rules, such as in the case of the BBNJ or the Convention on Biological Diversity via national jurisdiction. Others on account of, unfortunately, continuing disputes and disagreements about what rules should prevail. Nonetheless, despite that, even though this is imperfect, after all, the rest of the international legal system is also imperfect, the Philippines has invested a lot in trying to advocate for UNCLOS and the rule of law more generally, because of what you will see to be its importance to the Philippines as a maritime and archipelagic nation and as a developing nation as well. So, I'll not go into the details of UNCLOS. A crash course on this takes several days. Usually I give it to the Foreign Service Institute of the Department of Foreign Affairs, and I usually end up giving 2 days, literally 2 full days of lectures just to lay out the substance of UNCLOS. It's a convention that has 311 articles and 9 annexes, and then then you have all those 3 other conventions that followed it, and then you have the international jurisprudence since then and the practices. And it's really quite complex, but generally, to give you a broad overview, it lays down the framework for management of the oceans. First, by about a third of it is devoted to describing the maritime zones and the rights and duties and obligations of the coastal state, the one who is entitled to those zones, and a foreign flag state or user state, meaning other nations who use those waters. So their rights and obligations, depending on each type of zone, are laid out there and specified. And then within that system, you also will find specific rules on various activities in the ocean, such as navigation and commerce, principally, fisheries and exploitation of living resources, energy exploration and exploitation, as well as that of non-living resources in the ocean, marine environment protection, which actually constitutes about another third of the convention, and this is one of those new rules that were negotiated in the course of the UNCLOS conferences. Another new part was the one that regulates marine scientific research in the oceans, both within national jurisdiction and beyond, and also promotes the transfer of marine science and technology. And then also the rest are allocations of various jurisdictions, such as flag state jurisdiction or port state jurisdiction, which would be cross-cutting across these different activities. In addition, UNCLOS also contains a lot of rules for the protection and preservation of the marine environment, and the there's the marine science and technology transfer, as well as the promotion of peaceful modes of dispute settlement. Actually, the part of UNCLOS, Part 15, which deals with peaceful modes of dispute settlement, is regarded as the most comprehensive systems of dispute settlement, second only to the enumeration in the UN Charter, in one provision of the different ways in which states may settle their disputes. Now, UNCLOS is something that the Philippines contributed to, especially in its advocacy of a maritime and archipelagic nation, but it also joined with African countries in the course of these negotiations. And there were new concepts that were introduced because of this advocacy, led by the African countries and joined by other developing nations in the world. The concept of the exclusive economic zone, the entitlement of states, coastal states, to the living resources within 200 nautical miles of their baselines or their coast, essentially. That was proposed by Kenya and supported by the Asian African Legal Consultative Committee in 1971. And this was in preparation for this, what turned out to be a decade of negotiations. And in several other conferences, this was reiterated. And the idea was so, many of the developing states especially found that idea so fitting, and they were so enamored by it that they didn't even wait for UNCLOS to finish negotiations, and they all started declaring exclusive economic zones or exclusive fishing zones without waiting for the conclusion of these negotiations in the 1970s. If you study international law, you'll find that the idea of the exclusive economic zone, some scholars have referred to it as a form of instant customary international law. Basically, the emergence of state practice that is regarded as law by the states themselves, through consistent practice. Normally, this takes a long time. But in the case of the EEZ, it took about a decade only, where all states found it to be such a good idea that they decided, okay, this is law, let's have one, let's declare our EEZ. The Philippines was one of them. We declared our EEZ in 1978. UNCLOS concluded only in 1980. The negotiations for UNCLOS concluded only in 82, and it only entered into force in 1994. So, and actually, by the time that the UNCLOS opened for signature in 82, more than 40 countries had already declared EEZ. So, that's how important this contribution is to the corpus of international law. Another idea that was contributed by the African countries together with other developing states was the idea of the common heritage of mankind, a principle which ensures equitable distribution of the resources of the global commons, the areas that are beyond the territorial sovereignty and exclusive sovereignty of coastal states, and the assurance that this should be accessed, this should be exploited in a way that also is redistributed for the common good. So these were very important principles because of their goal of equitable sharing and access to the sea as a global commons. So you see there that as developing nations, the Philippines and African nations, including South Africa, have that very basic common and mutual interest. Now, of course, in each area of the world, the differences in geography, differences in economic relationships, differences in interests will create varied situations and differences in the way that they regard each other's interests. And that's where we're finding ourselves, at least in the Philippines, no? To be extremely challenged. The Philippines as a maritime archipelagic nation is also a major crossroads of international maritime traffic. Okay? So you see here, this is a heat map, I guess that's what they're called, of ship routes, or rather the travels of ships for 1 year. If I'm not mistaken, this is 2020 to 2021, collected and traced by computer using the data on transponders aboard many of the ships now. Okay, these are what we call AIS data, Automatic Identification System data. This became a recommended piece of equipment for all ships of 500 gross tons and above. These would basically be cargo vessels. No? And they regularly transmit the data of their location. And so if you collect the data and then trace them, this is actually what comes up as the usage of our waters, not only by Philippine vessels, but basically by all international vessels. And you see that the Philippines is crisscrossed by ships of all nations. And these ships, these lines basically represent the routes of maritime trade through the archipelago, of just about anybody. And as routes, shipping routes, they also represent routes that could also be used by not just commercial vessels, but also military vessels of all nations. And this is where we find one of our greatest challenges in ocean management. Because when it comes to ships, those of you who are familiar with it, there is a concept called flag state jurisdiction. Jurisdiction over a vessel can only be exercised by the ship's flag state, meaning the state to which it is registered, no? And the state whose flag it is flying. So that's why you see like Liberian vessels, Panamanian vessels, Philippine vessels, etc. What that means is that if you have a problem with the vessel, as a general rule, you have to go complain to the flag state, because they're the ones which have the exclusive jurisdiction over anything that happens with that vessel. There are, of course, some exceptions now because of UNCLOS again. It's part of the whole idea of compromises between coastal states and user states. But still, for most purposes, flag state jurisdiction is the one that applies. And that means that for us, as a maritime archipelagic nation, in order for us to secure our oceans for whatever purpose, whether to preserve the marine environment, to manage the fishing, etc., we need the cooperation of the flag states of the world which fly our waters. Now, that is a lot easier said than done. Okay? The challenge for us is that we have such great interests in our seas, which I can now illustrate to you. As a maritime archipelagic nation, our food and environmental security is dependent on our seas. Partly, as you see here, this is just a kind of illustration. The green areas as well basically represent plankton, phytoplankton, which are the base of the marine food chain. So where the plankton are, the fish will follow. And so all higher forms of fish will also start eating them. So plankton are eaten by small fish are eaten by bigger fish are eaten by large fish are eaten by politicians, I don't know. So that's why this is also a good proxy for representing, at least in one instant of time, where fish may be found. Of course, since plankton is mobile on the waters, this is constantly changing, constantly being redistributed. Okay. The orange or red parts that you see around the islands, which have now been colored in black, those represent coral reefs, which are the most productive marine ecosystems in the world. There are three: coral reefs, mangroves, and seagrass. But coral reef is the top, is on top of three. Coral reefs support food fisheries in the Philippines, and so these marine habitats and species in our waters are vital to our food supply. 30% of our coral reef inventory is actually located in what we call the West Philippine Sea, in our EEZ to the west of the country. Okay? And therefore, fisheries will actually be, the continuation and sustainability of our fisheries will be dependent on the status of those reef areas west of the country. Also, the connection, the biological connection between the areas west of the country and our inter-island waters is also clear. You can sense it from the coloration here. They're linked. So that whatever happens on the western side of the country, the West Philippine Sea, or EEZ there, if for any reason it is no longer biologically productive, the sustainability of our inter-island waters will be affected, because our scientists have found that there is a clear connection between the species in these waters. They essentially replenish each other. Okay? And that's why it's very important for us. Okay? In addition to the fisheries, we've now also realized the value of, well, these are sometimes called non-extractive uses, tourism. No? Because we're an archipelagic country, many of our tourist spots are actually coastal, well, beach resorts and island resorts and whatnot. These are all coastal tourism activities. And in 2024, they contributed 8.9% of GDP. A large part of that is coastal tourism. So you see that the contribution, the tangible contribution made in terms of food security, environmental security to our national economy. Our trade and economic security is also affected, very greatly invested in our sea areas. You see here, again, the same lines and ship routes. If you consider that these represent the routes of both domestic shipping, meaning inter-island shipping, as well as international shipping, shipping between us and foreign countries, domestic shipping trade alone is worth 1.31 trillion, about 3.8% of our GDP. And then international maritime navigation itself is also quite valuable. It is thought that anywhere from 3.3 to 5.3 trillion US dollars worth of trade passes through the areas to the west of us. And a lot of that probably also connects with the different domestic ports that we have, because our trade also goes through that area to the west. You can also see very clearly here that if for any reason we were to be deprived of access, independent access to the areas west of the Philippines, essentially our trade can be held hostage. We can be greatly influenced if we are unable to maintain our trade links with the rest of Asia, and by implication the rest of the world as well, to the west of the country. Even our air travel depends on our free access to the West Philippine Sea, to the areas west of us. So you see here some of the major international air routes. It's been recorded that around 50,000 aircraft per year pass west of the Philippines. Some of them connect to our ports, to our airports, of course. It's how we're able to travel all the way here. Actually, I had to go through there. We'll go westward to Abu Dhabi, then south. So our access to the rest of the world, a large part of it goes through that area. Okay. And so again, if for any reason that airspace to the west of the country were to become territorial airspace of another country, our air access could easily be held hostage as well. Or we could be subject to extreme influence by that country if it chose to deny us access through the airspace there. In terms of energy and economic security, it also plays a key role. That area west of the Philippines is still our most prospective petroleum province. Okay. Since the 1970s, we have been exploring for petroleum in that area. We have found quite a lot of stranded resources, and many oil companies continue to try to bid for areas in there because they know that that's where petroleum has the highest probability of being found. So far, we have only one natural gas production platform, and that single platform already contributed 20% of the energy needs of the capital area, what we call the island of Luzon. And it's about to run out. Originally, it was supposed to end by 2024, but the contractors say that by investing a little bit more, meaning and that also means it will cost more, they will be able to extend it up to around 2032, which is still quite close. And we still haven't been able to find a way to replace the supply for that has been given by that single platform, because disputes over the West Philippine Sea particularly, and pressure from a certain country, is preventing us from even continuing our exploration. Now, There are also other potential energy resources there, the so-called gas hydrate deposits in the deep seabed. This is something for the future, but some of the literature indicates that they may also be found in the deep sea areas in that area, in that region. And we also have, of course, because of the biodiversity resources, the potential for genetic resources. And this is present not only in the western parts of the countries, but also in all of our inter-island waters. Recently, attention has been put to our communications and economic security because the modern economies now cannot run without connection through the internet. Banking transactions, trade transactions, all of these activities now, because of the extensive computerization and automation that has been included in all of these activities, we cannot survive economically without access to the internet. And access to the internet is provided through submarine cables that you see here now indicated in this map. All of the major submarine cables that connect the Philippines are on the western side of the country. In the past 3 years now, especially, we've already seen the potential impact of interference and sabotage of submarine cables in Europe. No? First with Ukraine, then later in the Baltics. More recently, earlier this year, we had instances of potential sabotage of submarine cables to the north of the Philippines around Taiwan. So here, this is something that is right now still being studied because it has turned out to be extremely difficult, number one, to find out where these cables are because there's no central repository. The companies that lay them tend to not want people to know where they are as a measure of security. It is almost impossible to find out who are the real stakeholders per cable because you have to trace where the data is going physically, and it's practically impossible. And so there is now quite a lot of interest on the geopolitical value and impact of submarine cables. And this is another aspect of maritime interest. So you see, it's the sea is very, very important for us. And that's just the ones that we more or less have some idea of. There are still other marine resources that remain unexplored and untapped. So other forms of ocean energy, seabed minerals, which was mentioned earlier by Daniela, genetic resources, which is very relevant because of the BBNJ convention. That was precisely the focus of interest of that convention. And these interests are all present in both national waters, meaning the maritime zones that are recognized in international law, as well as domestic waters that we've identified through our own domestic legislation. So you see here that we've sort of divided our waters as well among the local governments. Okay. But the point here is that there is so much, we have so much interest in the resources and the uses of our oceans, of our sea areas, and yet it also is probably the most difficult to pursue, protect, and manage because we're not dealing only with local stakeholders, we're also dealing with the rest of the international community. So, maritime geopolitics, if there is such a term, is concerned really with the issues that arise out of potential contests for control of these sea areas. Now, one good example of that is essentially what happened between the Philippines and China. Okay? For those of you who are not familiar with the issue, the Philippines, as you know, as I mentioned, we've advocated the recognition of our rights and entitlements under UNCLOS, our entitlement to the maritime zones, the largest of which is the exclusive economic zone, the largest area there. Extending up to 200 nautical miles, and beneath it, the continental shelf, which coincides in most cases with the EEZ boundary. Our problem, however, is that when it comes to the western side, which is the South China Sea, note, South China Sea is a geographic term. It's not a term of attribution of ownership. It's simply the historical term used for that area. Our problem is that China has been claiming practically all of the South China Sea, and as illustrated through the so-called 9-dash line map, which it submitted to the United Nations in 2009. Now, since that time, frictions began to intensify, leading to, things came to a head in 2012. No? There was an incident with respect to one reef, Scarborough Shoal, which is on the upper half of the western country. And because, well, it's another long story, probably another lecture, but long and short of it is that it led the Philippines to decide that as a nation which had no military power compared to China, its only recourse was through the rule of law and the peaceful modes of dispute settlement. So we resorted to the modes of dispute settlement under UNCLOS, what we call arbitration under Annex 7 of UNCLOS, because Annex 7 is what provides the procedure. Okay. So the Annex 7 arbitration is what we pursued to try to vindicate our rights with respect to this area. Why? Because at the time, as of 2013, so 2012, 2013, the problem was that China's claim to the South China Sea was being made, well, essentially unilaterally on the basis of what it referred to as historic rights. Arguments like, well, it's called the South China Sea, therefore it belongs to China. Or arguments that we're the oldest civilization in this region, we've been here 2,000 years, and we were the first to explore that area, we were the first to fish in that area, therefore it belongs to us. Those types of historic arguments based on supposed ancient history. But our position was that, you know, if you're going to go by history, so-called ancient history, then there's no contest. The one with longer records or longer prior existence, prehistoric existence, will always win. And so that is not an acceptable standard, especially for modern states. We also argued that, well, China negotiated, was one of the parties that negotiated UNCLOS. And in UNCLOS, China basically also agreed to the concept of the EEZ and the continental shelf extending 200 nautical miles. And so the issue that was raised was that, can such a claim to historic rights over such a vast area, no, an entire sea, is that legally permissible still, in the light of the fact that the international community already negotiated UNCLOS, and the Philippines as well as China also ratified UNCLOS. So we were insisting on that. The problem, this became a very, very clear issue for us because our ability to access the ocean, if this was not resolved, was going to be uncertain. Essentially, because of that claim, if there is no answer to the question, the only area of the sea to which we are entitled to rights, exclusive rights, specialty resources, would be that blue area that you see there. And the rest would be uncertain. And in that sense, then, how can investments be attracted? As you know, companies especially would want certainty. This kind of legal uncertainty, was intolerable. And that was created because of China's expansive claim to the entire South China Sea, as encompassed in the 9-dash line. So, as of 2012, the Philippine government basically decided that this is intolerable, we need certainty. And so, we basically put the question before the International Tribunal. Is China's claim to the entire South China Sea, as illustrated by the 9-dash line, is that possible? Is that valid? Or has that been rendered invalid by the fact that since then, we've already negotiated and ratified UNCLOS? Okay. So, after 3 years of litigation, in 12 July 2016, the tribunal made the decision. And the decision, on almost all points, maybe around 98% of our claims, was vindicated. It vindicated the Philippines. The tribunal essentially declared China's claim to that entire area to be invalid. That it could not make such a claim, especially in light of UNCLOS. And besides, any claim that it made to prior historic jurisdiction or sovereignty, etc., number one, was not supported by evidence. Probably one of the clearest evidence of that is the fact that the entire region was colonized by ships going through the South China Sea. But there is also a clear evidence that in the first place, the claim, as described, was not made officially, was not even published to the entire world until 2009. Prior to that, it was basically just internal documents of China. Second, after it was publicized in 2009, most of the other none of the other states around it, none of those that were affected, recognized it. In fact, other states expressly rejected it. And therefore, the claim could not stand. And that meant that the Philippines could lawfully lay claim and be entitled to its 200-mile EEZ continental shelf. It could even extend it a little bit more because UNCLOS also provides a means for extending your claim to the seabed beneath, through the concept of the extended continental shelf. Long and short of it, the Philippines was fully entitled to these extensive maritime zones extending west to the Philippines. If at all there is still any remaining dispute between the Philippines with respect to the sea areas, it would be only the territorial seas that are attached to each island or rock above water at high tide, because that's the only one that can generate a territorial sea. And the tribunal ruled that none of the islands and rocks within this region were entitled to EEZs or continental shelf. They were basically entitled only to 12 nautical mile territorial seas. And that meant that the only areas in dispute now between the Philippines and China would be those small enclaves. Because the tribunal did not and could not rule on the sovereignty over these islands and rocks. It was a tribunal established under the law of the sea, not the law of the land. Okay, so that's that basic. So that remains pending. But with respect to the waters around them, it is clear that the waters either belong to the Philippines as part of its EEZ continental shelf, and that means not absolute sovereignty, but rather sovereign rights, meaning all of the natural resources there pertain to the Philippines. It's more akin to property rights. Okay? And it's either for the Philippines within 200 nautical miles, or beyond it, it would be part of the high seas, meaning it remains a part of the global commons. Okay. So that's why the tribunal's decision was key for the Philippines. Okay. And China could only make a claim in accordance with UNCLOS, which meant that even in the best case scenario, they could only lay claim to an EEZ and continental shelf extending 200 miles from their mainland coast, as you see there. Okay? So that is the maximum area as far as the tribunal is concerned, or as far as the Philippines is concerned, that they might be able to lawfully, legitimately claim. So the South China Sea Arbitration Award is very good reading. You learn a lot about international law and the history of maritime law about that. It's 501 pages, very thick. It's also good. It's also good for insomnia. Okay. You can either hit your head or you can use it as a pillow. Or if you want to resort to violence, you can throw it against somebody you don't like. It's very heavy. Okay. But essentially, the key takeaways are that China's claims, excessive claims, are invalid in light of UNCLOS. The Philippines is entitled to its 200-mile EEZ continental shelf. That is also lawful, and therefore China's claims to resources within that area, within those 9 dash lines, are invalid and illegitimate. And the only legally or legitimately disputed areas now are diminished to those small enclaves around each island or rock. Okay. So that is essentially the impact of the ruling. However, our problem is that despite that ruling, China refused to participate in the arbitration and refuses to accept that. And since that time, it has persisted in pushing its claim to the point that after 2016, instead of abiding by the tribunal's ruling, it doubled down even more, increased its persistent presence in these areas. This is just an illustration of the patrols, the regular patrols that they've been doing through their Coast Guard ships. So you see that they're basically filling up the region, and notice that it's not only with respect to the Philippines, but also with respect to the other countries around the South China Sea, because China is also claiming parts of their waters in turn. So it is essentially, since that time, it has essentially tried to occupy, quote unquote, these areas, even though they're just water, by anchoring vessels on them. And then more recently, since 2014, that has expanded now to the air. They're using drones to fill the air, basically. And all of it intended to push us out of the West Philippine Sea. And this we find to be problematic because during the UNCLOS negotiations, China was on the side of the Philippines and other developing states advocating for an EEZ, contending that this is good against hegemony, especially of the Western powers. It's in solidarity with the third world. It would prevent the maritime powers at the time from taking the fish close to other countries' resources, and it would allow the developing countries to protect their natural resources and sovereign economic rights. The problem is now that China has become the maritime power in the region, it has turned around and is doing exactly what it said the other maritime powers would be doing against developing states like the Philippines. So that's why it's problematic for us. And since 2022, this has been very, very visible. Since 2022, particularly it intensified with these types of activities, including ramming our government vessels, practically swarming all of the reefs with maritime militia boats. In 2024, there's even one instance of an illegal use of force when 8 Chinese Coast Guard vessels essentially attacked 2 Philippine Navy vessels that were resupplying an outpost on one of the reefs. And it resulted in injury as well as damage to the vessels. They never admitted any wrongdoing there. And then last month, it came to a head again with this. They were trying to ram a Philippine Coast Guard vessel. There were 2 ships, the China Coast Guard and the Chinese Navy vessel. They were trying to sandwich it. And they did it 2 times, sort of crisscrossing and scissoring it, trying to squeeze it in between them. On the 3rd time, they instead collided against each other, resulting in major damage to the Coast Guard vessel. The bow was basically flattened. At least 2 people reportedly died. Many more were injured because that's like, what is this? Around 2,000 ton vessel hitting another vessel of 7,500 tons, moving at maximum speed, let's say about 35 to 40 kilometers an hour, suddenly coming to a complete stop. And you can imagine the crew, boom, okay, suddenly stopping. So this is the situation that we're faced with, and that's why we're going on an advocacy to try to give our side around this issue. For Africa and South Africa particularly, we feel that there are some common interests that we can talk about, no? That can be the starting point in this issue. We have interests in cooperation to articulate the interests, especially of the Global South, developing countries that are not as powerful as some. We have shared interests in multilateralism, lateralism and international law to address regional international challenges, such as what is happening with the governance of our oceans. South Africa itself is the Philippines' largest trading partner in Africa. And we can cooperate on some key interests, such as agriculture and agri-industry, tourism promotion, science, technology, and even mining activities, which we know is a very difficult issue for many of us. And lately, we've also noticed the possibility of emerging defense cooperation and economic development cooperation between our 2 countries. So, with that, let me just conclude again to just emphasize some of the key points here. As you mentioned, the Philippines is a maritime and archipelagic nation with extensive, legitimate maritime interests. And those interests impel us to try to protect our seas as well as try to get the cooperation and assistance of other countries, other members of the international community to help us in pursuing those interests. These interests, unfortunately, are being challenged by unilateral, unlawful, and coercive actions in our part of the world. And as a smaller power, we can never match the military and political might of this competitor, but we have to rely upon international law, in this case particularly UNCLOS, to protect our lawful maritime rights and entitlements. That's all we're asking for, recognition and respect for our lawful maritime rights and entitlements, no more, no less. And so, you could say the Philippines is trying to be hopeful. We continue to have faith that despite all of the other things going on in the world, all the crazy things going on, we still continue to have faith that the international community will support our lawful rights and entitlements under UNCLOS. So I hope that's been helpful. Thank you very much for listening.